Okay, now I want to introduce Ghassan Hage, who many of you will know anyway. It's nice to have Ghassan come back to the western suburbs of Sydney. I kind of like to remind him that he was here some many moons ago. In fact, the institute that I now are part of, and many of the staff here, began in some form as a kind of a thing called the Research Centre for Intercommunal Studies about 20 years ago, 20-something years ago. A very fledgling little organisation that Ghassan was involved with. Ghassan, as an anthropologist, areas of research around racism, multiculturalism, national belonging and so on. Most of you will know his famed and provocative book, White Nation, but of course he has a slew of books since then that are equally provocative and engaging. The one that's about to come out, I think, is something that we should be looking forward to. Is racism an ecological threat, or has it gone back to environmental? Ecological? Environmental? Is racism an environmental threat, which I think would be a kind of interesting thing for us to have a look at. But please, welcome Ghassan to the stage. We'll be talking about reflective writing today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here. And I'm going to give a casual chat, and a chat in the sense that I would have a kind of imaginary supervision session with a meta student, and which is a kind of like a sum of the many supervisions I've had in my life, and think of some themes that I feel have some relevance and some meaning across time and space. And the aim, obviously, is, as always, never to deliver any truth, but just to hopefully stimulate your thinking about the project of writing that you are engaging in. And especially, in a sense, a project of writing and knowing the specialness of the space in which you are writing, that space that is referred to as PhD space. Because PhD space is really a heterotopic space today. And it is heterotopic in so many ways, not least that everything about the logic of social existence today runs against the idea of sitting down and thinking. Name me one university, not just, by the way, society, even the institution of the university itself and its logic militates against the ethos of a PhD. I don't know of any university today which brands itself with something like, "Welcome to the University of blah, blah, blah. Take your time." No. And here is the nature of this heterotopic place, because it is a space which is so special. You will probably never experience such a space ever again. Even if in your academic career, you will not have a space where you're just thinking about a single project, writing project. You might be at a variety of stages in your PhD. You might have some teaching, and you've already mastered the idea of whinging about, oh, how am I going to write and teach at the same time, and all of this stuff. And still, you still need to recognize that you are in an exceptionally special place, about this space where you just sit, think about a single project for a long period of time. But it is a negotiation, because on one hand, you have a necessary imperative which says, take your time. And on the other, you have a necessary institutional imperative which says you have to deliver on time. And the negotiation between taking your time and delivering on time is of the essence of a PhD. If you let one leg of the equation take over the other, one leg of the antinomy take over the other, you will not succeed. If all you do is have in front of you the idea of delivering on time, you are sure to produce intellectually lazy stuff in which you are rushing to produce things, etc. And if you just take your time, you engage in a different kind of intellectual laziness, which is a laziness which involves thinking without producing. This is actually a more vicious kind of laziness, because it's a laziness which involves a certain jouissance. You know, thinking, I'm thinking. Oh, fantastic, like I had great thoughts, thought. And you can sort of like forever dwell in the domain of thinking. And the fact of the matter is that, and it's a real thing in my experience, the transition from thinking to writing what you're thinking is sometimes brutal. It's brutal because it actually, writing involves a certain reality principle. And it starts involving even a kind of like doing violence to what you're thinking. And you realize that you can never actually have a great thought which ends up on paper as writing without an element of violence. You never, it's a classic Lacanian thing where you are never satisfied with what you are writing in relation to what you are thinking. You know, writing always lacks compared to thinking. And so some people hate that moment of the reality principle and in a sense retreat into thinking. And it's a real threat to PhD projects. The fact that people are scared of the transition to the moment of writing, but not just writing systematically, writing rigorously. That's why we find so many strategies of escape in writing. There's kind of like an escapism, all forms of escapism that I encounter. And I encounter not from a position of superiority. I encounter because I have to fight myself all the time. And so it's not that I'm some superior person who does not experience the lure of laziness, etc., and therefore I'm projecting and guiding you into a different, no, it's everything I'm saying is constantly a question of self-critique, really, and self-practical critique. How to make myself right and not fall into half-truth, the power of half-truth, which is that they're always true half-truths, you know. Like there's no such thing as objectivity. You know, we all know from forever, kind of like these half-truths. There's no such thing as objectivity. And you know, there's no such thing as objectivity can be a research program towards really rigorous writing, and it can be a kind of like sloppy, laissez-faire. Somehow, some people transition from there's no such thing as objectivity to there's no such thing as rigor. There's no such thing as objectivity to there's no such thing as trying to be objective, for God's sake. You know, it's not bad to try to be objective, knowing that there's no such thing as objectivity, as opposed to using, you know, I mean, like it's a simplistic thing, there's no such thing as objectivity, I know, but you will see it circulating again and again as a kind of like shortcut towards not doing things, like imagined communities. I've written before about imagined communities, and it's nothing against Anderson or the concept of imagined community as he deployed it, but I look at so many theses where the person is looking at the community of Lebanese in Toronto, and I say, well, how do you know there's a community? Have you examined that there's what kind of relations? If you have a community, you have to have relations, for God's sake. Like, community means relation. And I'm looked down at, says, but no, it's not that kind of community. It's an imagined community. And somehow imagined community becomes a license not to empirically examine whether there's a community or not. And imagined becomes the product of your imagination more than anybody else's, really. There's so many shortcuts like this. Like in my field, I often hear actually others say, anthropology is complicit with colonialism. Anthropology is complicit with colonialism. That's it. Like, I don't want to look at it. Anthropology is complicit with colonialism. Therefore, I shouldn't rate, you know, as if there's somewhere pure out there which is worthy of your reading power. Then there's, today, increasingly, there's complexity, you know. I mean, I've got, complexity is a bit of a bête noire for me, I have to admit. Like, I get really frustrated with complexity, especially people who intervene when I'm talking to say, but things are more complex than this. I hate it when someone says, things are more complex. Well, you know, I mean, like, I've known that things are complex since I was 10, you know. I don't need anybody telling me that life is complex. I'm trying to shed some light on things. Either you can shed some light or piss off, you know. I don't need to be reminded that things are more complex than this. And so complexity, again, sort of like as a paradigm, can sometimes be the source of some seriously superficial stuff, you know. A substitute, in fact, for rigorous complexity. So it is in relation to this that notion of reflexivity, writing reflexivity, becomes crucial as something to think about when you are writing in general, but especially because you have the time in the process of writing a PhD. Reflexivity. So it's not something you do as opposed to something you don't do. reflexivity, you know. As we know forever, and Kant has developed it very well, it is by the very nature of human thought to have this transcendental capacity of not just being some utterance, but always having a transcendental quality. So it's not about being reflexive as opposed to not being reflexive. It's more about how do you develop reflexivity? How do you develop that reflexivity that you have? How do you actually make it grow, make it become more sophisticated, etc.? How do you arm it, in the sense of weaponize it, to have a way of acting on your writing? So how do you nourish it? So these are the issues that always sort of like, again, it varies from one person to another, etc., but it always involves this idea of, so how capable are you of capturing the assumptions that you make when you write a sentence? You know, every sentence you write is full of unspoken assumptions. And to me, reflexivity by degrees. The more you are capable of reflecting and capturing assumptions, the better. There's no end to this process, you know. It's not that you can or you don't. But the quality of writing involves, in a very important way, to what extent are you capable of thinking about the assumptions of what you say? Thinking that there are assumptions here and that they are worthy of your consideration. So, you know, sometimes someone says because. Like I read in the text and I say, this word here, because, blah, 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 because. And because involves a whole philosophy of social science and causality behind it. Say, I said because, assuming some form of causality. Some form. Now, do I write because and let it be? Or have I written because knowing what kind of social causality I'm actually conjuring by writing that very word because? Am I thinking in temporal causality, historical causality? Am I thinking in structural causality? Am I varieties of structural causality? Like, you know, I'm not saying that every single person who writes because will have to go through a history of philosophy of social sciences, but I'm saying that there is a difference between a because which shows that there has been a reflection that is embodied in it, and a because where there's no reflection. You read a sentence and you know there's labor behind this sentence. There's a labor of reflexivity. And in a way, that's where we will always end up with the question of how much labor has there been in this sentence. And it's a bit like dead labor in Marxist theory. It's embodied. And so it's very hard to actually know for sure but what and how, but I can guarantee you that a well-seasoned examiner, and we have to talk about examiners in a PhD, will recognize labor in a sentence. Will recognize it. You probably will ask this examiner, what are the criteria? And they will not be able to tell you. But they will be able to tell you that this sentence, there's labor behind it. And I recognize it, and I appreciate it, as opposed to saying, no, I can see this. Like, this sentence has been written in 2 seconds. I can actually recognize this sentence. It's the same sentence I had when I was having a chat in a coffee shop yesterday, sort of like. And the PhD sentence is not a sentence which you produce as you are having a chat in a coffee shop. It's a sentence which you have to hammer and labor over, and etc. The same goes for the paragraph, the same goes for text. So, one area which I want to spend some time talking about of this kind of labor is the labor of data. The labor of data. The labor of, and I don't mean data in a positivist sense. I don't mean necessarily data as in statistical data, but I include statistical data in that. Interview material, photos that you have, anything that you feel is for you something brought from the social world into your writing as evidence. Now, what is evidence? I don't want to go into a whole lecture on that, but no, probably do you want me to. But one of the things that I have noted so often, and that's what I want to talk about, and and because it's one of those things, how can we describe it? I mean, it's one of those things where when you tell yourself what to do, it's so obvious, and yet it's not so easy to do. And that has to do with the question of perspectivism. The question of, I call it perspectivism after Nietzsche, but it's a question of whose perspective is embodied in your evidence. Where does it come from? Who produced it? That issue of perspective is really quite haunting. It haunts me all the time because I find it so easy to slip into, and that itself is an interesting thing to reflect on. Why is it so easy to slip into the illusion of perspectiveless knowledge? Why is it so easy to think that there is such a thing as what Nietzsche scoffs at, which is eyeless knowledge, a knowledge which somehow nobody's gazing at from nowhere. And if we say to ourselves, and that's where the difficulty lies, if we say to ourselves, well, there is no such thing as perspectiveless knowledge. I mean, you might get an odd person who wants to be a pain in the ass and engage in a philosophical rave about, oh yes, there is such a thing as perspectiveless knowledge. Maybe. But on the whole, people say, yeah, sure, I agree with you. There's no such thing as perspectiveless knowledge. I say, okay, so let's look at a paragraph you're writing. Again, I'm telling you about me, you know. I am someone who hammers myself all the time that there is no such thing as perspectiveless knowledge. And I'm aware of it, and I reflect all the time on the fact of saying, whose perspective is embodied in what I'm writing. And then I read a page that I've written, and I notice, oh, I'm actually assuming here that nobody, where did this come from? Nobody has looked at, produced this data. Now, this question of perspective is nonetheless so crucial. There are people who are hopelessly perspectiveless. I mean, I still get critiques of some work I've done on racism, where people can't recognize the difference between, say, you know, like just recently, because it's exemplary and it's in my mind, sort of like in my recent work on racism and environmental racism, I'm talking about how there's a shift in the categorization, in racist categorization. In slavery, in regimes of slavery, the racialized is always associated with some form of labor. So they're useful. In migrant regimes of the 14th, also there is an element of labor, of incorporation. And I'm saying that today, not only is the racialized categorized as a category of waste, but as a category of unrecyclable waste. And so I was thinking actually that the gaze and the language the Australian government was using about the refugees coming by boats, so as a presence in the sea, was astonishingly similar to the language used talking about these plastic agglomerations that form in the ocean. And they're kind of like waste, unrecyclable waste, threatening unrecyclable waste. So I was saying, blah, blah, blah. And you get someone say, aren't you making the other without agency by saying so? Say, excuse me, can't you tell the difference between me saying that someone is classified as waste and me saying they are waste, for God's sake? You know, it's like if you say sort of like, you know, I mean, the perspective of the knowledge becomes totally absent. So I'm saying from this perspective, the migrant is, or the refugee is conceived as waste. That doesn't mean they are waste, but also it means that you cannot look at their life if you don't include the fact that some of them gaze at them as waste. But it doesn't mean you jump to the conclusion that it's waste. Oh, no. Naughty, naughty, you think the other doesn't have agency. Now this is just to exemplify the question of, well, you take the category and say, who is producing the category? It's that simple as that, first, in perspectivism. But there's even more, many more difficulties, because, you know, today, especially with the ontological turn, it takes variety of forms in anthropology, in cultural studies, in etc. It takes various forms. You have to ask, well, what is a perspective? is a perspective, an epistemological question, which means we have a nice, neat reality here, and you have a view about reality from here, and a view B about reality, and a view C about reality. So these are all different perspectives on reality, which assumes that reality is already pre-existing and you have views of reality, different perspectives. Or do we have an ontological perspectivism, which cannot presuppose the existence of a reality? Here, a reality is the relation to reality. So there's relation A to reality that produces perspective A, which is a real reality. So multiplicity of realities, something I'll be talking about in my keynote on Saturday. But the point is, all I'm saying is that you have that piece of knowledge that you take as evidence, a photo, etc., and instead of going into positivist circles of, is it representative, and what kind of sort of like, and how many, and sort of like, etc., as if everything is about sort of positivist correlation and what have you, subject anything you have is good. Anything you have is good if it is subjected to rigor. If it is subjected to a reflection as to what is it that I have that I'm dealing with. Again, in racism, the number of works that study racism, racism. What is this? Racism as seen by who? Racism as experienced by whom? What is this thing called racism? There's racism from the perspective of the racist. There's racism from the perspective of the racialized. Whose experience are we examining? Okay, there's racism from the position of the analyst. That's also an experience. But you cannot assume that you are studying an experience-less reality called racism. You have to say, whose experience am I actually analyzing here? And that's incredibly absent, this kind of like reflexive mode on perspectivism. You have a flourishing, of course, of work on positionality. I think probably today it's one of the words which will appear like in healthy amounts of text. Positionality, positionality, positionality. Now, what kind of assumptions is involved with the very notion of positionality? How many people who start with the idea that identity is fluid and either blah, 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 and then go into positionality? What happened to fluidity? How do you reconcile? I'm not saying, I quote you, but please reflect with me. Why before identity was fluid and now I'm talking about positions? Maybe you can reconcile them, which is great, and I'm sure you can, but if I see a text where it's full of positionality and ends up telling me how from my positionality I have recognized fluidity. So why isn't there fluidity in your positionality? And so where's the positionality from which blah, blah, blah? Also positionality today is so ahistorical in the sense that, I mean, for a Bourdieuian like me, I immediately think of trajectory, which is a far more Nietzschean concept. Because, you know, you think in a space there's position A and position B, you know. That's positionality. But as Bourdieu made very clear, even if you are looking at class location within a field, the positionality doesn't tell you much if you don't have a historicized sense of trajectory. If A is experiencing downward social mobility and B is experiencing upward social mobility, they might end up both in the same positionality or same location. But if you don't know that one is experiencing upward social mobility and one is experiencing downward social mobility, you don't know much. The fact that they are existing in the same location does not tell us much about them. This is, in a sense, also where Nietzsche talks about sense of power. That's so crucial to me, you know, because Nietzsche's idea is that sometimes two forces or two entities or two even individuals have, let's think about it in a mythical way, have the same amount of power, are equally powerful. So let's think they have the same amount of weapons. Two nations have the same amount of weapons. Or two police forces have the same capacity for repression. Institutional, with technology, everything. But Nietzsche invites us to think that if one force thinks that its power is increasing, it will deploy power differently from the entity that thinks that its power is decreasing. If you have X amount of power and think your power is increasing, you might be magnanimous, Nietzsche says. But if you feel that your power is decreasing, then you become petty, mean, and cruel. Now, to me, this is cultural analysis, you know. Like if I want to study how empires deploy themselves, how capitalist state deploys itself, how certain repressive forces are deploying themselves today, without a sense of the sense of power of the apparatus, I will not understand cruelty to the other. Where does it come from today? It's not just about domination. It's about how you dominate, in what way, etc. This takes also domination. That's another interesting object of reflexivity. Again, because it is one which, and I'm trying to find concepts to think with you which have become so routinized in our tradition that we no longer reflect on them. And they are the dangerous categories. Domination. How many of us deploy domination today? And think, what does it mean? I have actually sort of like, I'm no longer clear it means anything, domination. I'm exaggerating, but what I'm saying is that, you know, what is domination? What is a relation of domination? And in what way a relation of domination, and I ask you this, is different from a relation of exploitation? Now, there was a time, and because of the historical period, not because we were more intelligent or etc., because of the historical period, we used to think a lot more about the difference between exploitation and domination. Now, I don't think anybody thinks about the notion of exploitation. except if exploitation is the topic that they are studying. You know, Agamben, etc. There's no exploitation. And this allows for a facility in the circulation of certain concepts, and it becomes a mode of flattening reality. Again, in my field, racism. What is the difference between, well, no, actually, not just racism. Let me give you 3 relations of domination that people, like when we are engaging in intersectionality, we say race, gender, sexuality. Let's say that. Race, gender, sexuality. Forget about class now, which is the obvious sort of like, but just take race, take race, class, sexuality. Race, domination. Class, domination. Gender, domination. Sexuality, domination. Now, there's a form of domination between heterosexuality and queerness. There's no doubt. And there's a mode of domination between males and females, patriarchal. But historically, I would say, one relation is extractive, the other isn't. Maybe not, but I want to think about this, right? I want to think about which one is extractive, not just which one is involved in domination. So gender relation, I think, historically, for me, has involved extraction, you know. It's not just about domination, it's about sucking out of the dominated into the dominant, sucking labor at the least, sucking emotions even, what have you. That defines gender domination. Now, again, sexual domination, I'm not so sure, right? I'm not so sure that I would say that males, to form in a patriarchal relation, need to suck all kinds of social nutrition in the form of labor, emotions, etc., from women, in the essence of the patriarchal relation. I'm not so sure that for the heterosexual to exist, they need to suck. Don't. In the way I am thinking about it, they don't need to suck social nutrition. They will suck something else. But yeah, so anyway, but it's a mode of thinking where in a relation there's a link, an umbilical cord linkage, where something is circulating. You know, I'm not satisfied in saying that there's a relation of domination between white and indigenous Australian, because it's not just white domination. It's accompanied with that notion of inequality, you see. And again, it comes to the essence of how do we reflect on the notion of a relation. When we say a relation of inequality, I say there's a relation of inequality. What's a relation of inequality? I don't know. What's a relation of inequality seems to me a relation that the researcher establishes between two unequal entities and say, okay, I can compare between the two and I find that one is more than the other. So there's unequal. But what is a relation of inequality? I don't know. Yet people use it all the time, that there's a relation of inequality. you might come up with an answer, but I'm telling you, there's so many people who don't reflect on using relation of inequality. I don't know what it means. I tried to reflect on it. I'm not convinced there is such a thing as relation of inequality. It says, what does it mean? Let's reflect on indigenous health. And say the health of white Australia is groovy-doovy, the health of indigenous Australia is bad news, and relation of inequality. Inequality in wealth distribution. No, I don't know. I say there's a comparison, and we can make a comparison. Now, if I want to talk about relation, I would say there's a relation of exploitation. Now, that means that there's actually an umbilical cord connecting one to the other, and when I say this is high, I know it is high because the other is so. That is, it is sucking the shit out of one in order to be better than the other. That's not the same as inequality, relation of exploitation. Now, you know, so these reflections is not answers. I'm not trying to deliver you answers, but I'm saying so many of us today use these things. Now, in racism, I want to differentiate between anti-Semitism and colonial racism. Anti-Semitism was never a racism directed towards sucking labor out of Jewish people. It was by its essence exterminatory. Now, that's not the same in colonial racism, which can be exterminatory, can be non-exterminatory. Colonial racism needed the labor of others, and it exterminated when it didn't need labor. You can't say that about anti-Semitism. And so, to take anti-Semitism as the example of racism and transform it into a meta discourse about racialization, as Agamben does, and then people take it from Agamben and start using it in colonial situations, that's a problem to me. That's a problem of lack of reflexivity about the categories in which we are deploying and using. So, I've got 5 more minutes, and I've got about 100 things left to reflect on with you. I want to quickly talk about some reflexivity that is needed in relation to theory and the deployment of theory, which I don't want to talk about. If people are interested in it, it's actually, I've written this thing on my blog, and it has recently even appeared as an article in Anthropological Theory journal, which is how to interact with theory in your writing. But one of the issues I discuss has to do with what? With the question of theory as cultural capital. Theory as cultural capital, that is the imperative to show off your theory in PhD writing. And the fact that behind it, and that's not something I talk about in that article, that's why I want to talk about it here. Behind it is, I think, one of the least attractive things about PhD texts, and that is the fear of spoon feeding. PhDs are scared to spoon feed their reader because they think if their PhD has a pedagogical function, that the examiner might think they are lowly in terms of sophistication. And so a PhD will not go and say, I want to teach you, my dear examiner. I want to make clear what I'm writing. And they're scared to do this. I want to teach you. And believe me, you're wrong, because examiners are grateful when they read a text which spoon feeds them. They are unbelievably grateful. And yet, you're scared. I'm not saying you, but in general, there is this fear of appearing as if, oh no, I'm not sophisticated enough. I'm at the level, I want to operate at the level of blah, 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 and therefore I don't want to be seen as saying A, B, C, D, this is. I mean, it's a fear, but also it sometimes also lack of knowing, because you have to know a lot more in order to be able to engage in this form of spoon feeding. And I want to write, and I want to finish, I want to finish by just saying two quick things about writing as an ethos. One, and that's another one of those mysteries for me. We are laborers. We who write are laborers. We labor on writing. And we know that the labor of writing is not necessarily pleasant. And maybe because of this, we don't like to think much about the labor of writing. It might have a traumatic dimension for us. But I often wonder, given that we know how much we sweat on every sentence that we write, how dare we be so facile in our critique of others? Yeah? I mean, how dare we not be ethical enough to recognize in a sentence that we read the labor of others? Our experience of text is so fetishistic in a Karl Marx sense. It's as if they are their texts for our consumption on the market, and without the labor that has produced them. It's like this text against this text, like the commodity, as described by Marx. We look at text as this text versus this text versus this text, commodity versus commodity versus commodity. And we don't look at the text as the product of labor. And now, think about what does it mean to respect your labor and, in the process, respect the labor of others. And think, would you really want to be dismissive, agree? Would you like, after you've sitting down writing a paragraph for a week, someone treating it the same as if you're having a coffee shop conversation and you just come up with an idea and say, oh no, I don't agree with this, blah, blah, blah. Oh yeah, I agree with this, blah, blah, blah. So where and how do we inject an ethics of labor in our writing and reading? That is also an issue of reflexivity. And finally, also in relation to writing, something I brought up yesterday in celebrating Megan Morris's work, which has to do with writing as gift. Now, from a modernist position, I suppose, to say my writing is a gift is to say you're bloody pretentious wanker in an Australian modality of speaking, to say my writing is a gift to humanity or whatever. But think about gift theory and think what it means to give a gift. Like, one of the things I do with my students, I often bravely say, look, okay, some of you are paying for my lecture. You can treat my lecture as a commodity, And you can treat my lecture the way I like to think of my lecture, which is a gift to you. Now, think about the ethic of listening to a lecture. You're free to get your phone and play on your phone while you're receiving the lecture. But if you take the lecture as a gift, seriously, you'd be bloody rude receiving a gift while you're looking at your phone. There's an ethic involved of reception. Now, I think we all exist in a gift economy of writing. That's not the only one we exist in, but we all exist in that as well. And it is in our interest to actually pump that gift dimension in the way we offer and in the way we receive the gift of others. And it creates for far more, I think, communal sense of existence today, which I finish by saying it's so necessary. It takes us back to the heterotopic space in which we exist. We are not, I was 3 days ago in France, in Paris, with a number of scholars working on race and racism, etc. One of the things we were reflecting on, and that's not dramatic. If you think what I'm saying is dramatic, you're seriously remote from reality, let me tell you. We are reflecting on how often in history, taking like Walter Benjamin's history and others, how often in history when authoritarian regimes come to power, the first thing they round up are intellectuals. And the least expecting to be rounded up are intellectuals, because they sit like us thinking, oh, well, I'm thinking, and what the hell, and sort of like that's life for me, and I'm inoffensive, etc. And authoritarianism comes and hits you without you noticing. And they do again and again and again. And you need to communalize if you want to be a community of intellectual, critical, with a danger of being roundable. And you are, if you are a critical intellectual, as a PhD, you are today more than ever in danger of being roundable. Don't underestimate that. And so think about it. Thank you.